Okay.
Welcome, everybody. I am going to turn this over to Merle to introduce her very good friend.
Well, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Mrs. Cohn, who, I'm sure you all read the bio that was circulated earlier in the week. As you know, he's recently stepped down after over 30 years as chief of plastic reconstructive and cosmetic surgery at University of Illinois. He is originally from Athens, and you will hear a lot about the depth of his connection to his Greek culture today. Mimis has been also the director for several decades of a wonderful facility at UIC called the Craniofacial Center, where at no cost to the patients, they take children who have facial abnormalities and they give them a whole new life. And the services include surgery and dental and psychological and oral, meaning hearing, prosthetics. It's an amazing, amazing place. Mimis, separate from his professional endeavors, and he's been involved in many international and national professional organizations, has been his whole life a very avid student of the arts and of history. And today he's going to focus on the history of the Jews in Greece. And I just, as an anecdote, want to say that I've had the great privilege over the years of knowing his family. And I also have met one of the families that sheltered them and hid them during the war. And it's quite a story. Before the war, you may or may not know that in Greece, the Jews were very, very well assimilated, and there wasn't really friction with the Greek Orthodox. And then everything changed. So Mimis, take it away.
Thank you, Merle, and thank you, Barbara, and everybody else. And let me just put the commands together. And slideshow from the beginning. So as you heard, we're going to talk this afternoon about the Jews of Greece and the 25 centuries of continuous history. And just last week, I gave a lecture that was a combined lecture with some people who were in Greece. It was organized by the American Consul General and the ambassador in Greece. But my role was to speak about the Greek Jews in the States. So that reminded me of some stories when I first came in. A lot of people did not know the existence of Greek Jews. The Greek Americans were looking at me saying, Mrs. Cohen, but what is your Greek name? Is it Kohenakis, Kohenopoulos? The Jews didn't believe that I was Jewish enough because I didn't speak Yiddish. and then there was this professor of surgery who I went to introduce myself. He was born in Turkey and of Greek origin. And when I went to his office, he got up and with an expression in his face, he says, Mrs. Cohen, a Greek Jew, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, and he crossed himself. Anyway, that shows that the history of Greek Jews, which is a very long one, is not well known as the history of Jews around the world. So today we are going to focus on the Greek Jews. I don't know what's happening now. And interestingly enough, the Jews are mentioned in the Torah. Actually, they are, as descendants of Noah, the Greeks are mentioned, which means that there was connection way back then, and they were called Yavanim, which they are called even now. And the word comes from Ionia, which was the coast of what is now Turkey. And if you can see in the table of nations in the book of Genesis, which lists the descendants of Noah and the nations they founded, the Greeks appear under the name of Yavan, who is, interestingly enough, and that's fascinating to me, the connections, that is a son of Japhet. Now, Yavan is parallel to the Greek word Ionia, as I mentioned, but even more interestingly, Japhet is parallel with the Greek word Iapetos, who in Greek mythology was the father of Prometheus that you know very well in the Greek legend. And two other Greek nations are included in the book of Genesis, including somebody mentioned Rhodes. And so Rhodanim are included in the book of Genesis, as well as Kittim, which is a city in Cyprus. So the first organized Jewish communities were established in Greece about 400 before the Common Era. The communities flourished during the reign of Alexander the Great and the subsequent Hellenistic period. Jewish immigrants, but also slaves, flooded in the Hellenistic cities in Asia Minor, the Aegean coast, and the mainland. And the Jews retained their monotheistic religion, but many wealthy Jews were attracted to Greek culture and created a class of assimilated Greek Jews. There is an incredible book that was published by the Jewish Museum of Greece just a year ago. And in this book are listed, and there are included photographs of artifacts and not only funerary artifacts, but as you will see others that document the presence of Jews in Greece in various parts of what is now Greece. And so you can see inscriptions with the menorahs, and you can see inscriptions. This is transliteration, in other words, Greek letters, but with Jewish meaning. And this stone writing and carving, it's in Delphi, where a Jewish man is releasing his slave to Apollo. And so all this is detailed over there. But if you go to the museum in Israel, you will see Attic oil lamps and lekithos, which were typical for Athens, 5th century before Common Era, which means that there was connection and traveling between the two states. And coins, those are Athenian coins found in Israel. But the real story starts with Alexander the Great. And you can see there is a question mark about Alexander visiting Jerusalem in his way to the Persian Empire. According to Josephus, who was a Jewish historian in the Roman times, the high priest Simon Tzaddik, or Jadus, he marched out of the gates to Greek Alexander and prevent him from plundering the city. Alexander saw this man with the white robe and the wavy hair, and according to the tradition, he recognized in him the figure which had once appeared in a dream and encouraged him to wage war against the Persians. So fake news and propaganda were available even then. But furthermore, the Jews took advantage of the story also. So you can see the story goes that when Alexander saw the high priest, he knelt, and his generals say, "What are you doing? You are the king." And apparently Alexander said, "I only kneel for what he represents." He went to the temple and he said, "I would like to have a statue of mine in the temple." So the high priest said, We cannot do that. We don't put figures in our temple. However, we are going, in your honor, we're going to name our first born boys Alexander. And till now, this is the Hebrew writing of the name Alexander, and it still exists in Israel. The truth is that the story of Alexander visits to Jerusalem, although loaded with circumstantial details, is itself pure legend with no basis and any historical fact. And why would Alexander waste time to go to Jerusalem, which was for all particular purposes a very small place with no value to him? But the story remains alive and well for both Jews and Greeks. This is a wonderful mosaic that was recently excavated in the synagogue of Cohn in Israel. And you can see the high priest and Alexander and the armies and the Jews on this side well depicted. And then this is from a Christian side, from a holy book, which is in the Greek Institute in Venice. And again, you can see the Alexander and the priest. Anyway, the early diaspora started way before. The first one, of course, was a forceful diaspora, a forceful movement in Mesopotamia. But after that, between the 4th and 2nd century before the Common Era, the orange arrows will show you this time, Jews immigrated to various places, which is now Turkey, the Greek islands, and Alexandria. It is said that Aristotle, speaking about this Clerchus of Soli around 320 BC, he said that Jews are derived from the Indian philosophers. They are named by the Indians Kalami, but by the Syrians Judea, and took their name from the country they inhabit, which is called Judea. But for the name of their city, it is very awkward one, for it is called Jerusalem. He also goes on saying that now this man who was a large circle of friends and was in his way from interior to the coast, not only spoke Greek, but had the soul of a Greek. There is another story, and Areus was the king of Sparta, and there is a communication that was included in the books of Maccabees, and Areus, the king of Lacedaemonians, which is the area of Sparta, to Onias, high priest in Jerusalem, greetings. It is found in writing that the Lacedaemonians and Jews are brethren, and they are stock of Abraham. Now, therefore, since this is come to our knowledge, ye shall do well to write into us of your prosperity. They had nothing, you know that. We do write back again to you that your cattle and goods are ours, and ours are yours. But the very first true testimony of the settlement of Jews in Greece is recorded in a signpost found in Oropos near Athens. It dates between 300 and 250 before the Common Era and refers to a Jew called Moschos Moschionos. And so he is in this place in Oropos. There was a temple which was called Amphiaraion in the name of Amphiarios, who was one of the gods of health together with goddess Ygea. And he is dedicating this to offering to ask for health. So despite the fact that Jews maintained their religion, they took some influence from the Greek culture altogether. Then comes the Hellenistic period, which historically is the period after the death of Alexander the Great. As you recall, his generals divided the empire. Ptolemy went to Egypt and Seleucids in Syria. During this time, the Greek language was the language of everybody, as English is now. And the Jews assumed Greek customs and manners, but preserved their faith and dietary rules. There is an incredible body of literature describing the history of Jews and Greeks during the antiquity and their connections. Alexandria was by far the largest city and the cultural, financial, and political center of the Mediterranean world. Prosperous Greeks were speaking Greek at the time. As you recall, the Bible, the Testament, the Old Testament, was translated in Alexandria by the 70s. 70 sages participate in the translation. 7, of course, is a sacred number in Judaism also. And they translated the Old Testament, apparently at the request of Ptolemy the Philadelphus. But this translation had a political meaning as well, because the Jews in Alexandria had lost the language. They spoke all Greek. So by translating the Bible into Greek, then they got back in their roots. Paul and early Christians drew some of their knowledge as well from this transaction, and the seed of monotheism was introduced in the rest of the world. Unfortunately, the same time, the seeds of Judeophobia, not anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is a term which was established in the early 19th century by a German, surprise, but Judeophobia has been around us forever. This had to do with many reasons. Religious beliefs, being the chosen people didn't sit well with the rest of the world. Dietetic rules, we're talking about Hametz and other things earlier. Economic rules, without question, has been a problem from the beginning. And circumcision. Interestingly enough, circumcision is not just a Jewish custom, because, of course, the Jews inherited it from the Egyptians. Wherever you go in Egypt, you will see stories of circumcision for adults, and they are all standing. But also, this is from a Greek church, because Jesus was circumcised. Actually, in the Greek calendar, and there is a day for every saint possible, January 1st is mentioned as the day to commemorate the circumcision of Jesus, because it was 8 days after the birth. Anyway, we mentioned earlier that Jews were influenced by the Greeks, and you can see all the inscriptions here. It is a mosaic that is now in what is now Jordan, but you can read Iaia Polis Jerusalem, the holy city Jerusalem, and all this is in Greek. And you can also see how the prude shepherds of Judea changed their habits and wear all the robes and became assimilated, not the religion. So going back to the appearance of Jews in Greece, the oldest information we have after the inscriptions I gave you are in the island of Delos. For those of you who have been in the island of Mykonos, Delos is the island is inhabited, but is a sacred island. It used to be a sacred island during antiquity, and it was something like the Switzerland of the time. People, city states would deposit their money there, and there were a lot of merchants. So it is well documented that Jews were in Delos. According to Philo, Jews were involved in merchant marine, banks, as well as other businesses. There is a synagogue with a question mark. It was named, and I will show you the pictures, which was established in the 1st century before the Common Era. And there are inscriptions that were found. That's why the place it was named a synagogue. And there is a synagogue in Greek, the Ipsisto Theo, God Most Mighty. And this is what the archaeologists named the throne of Moses. There is a sign that this is the synagogue, and we know that there were more than one synagogues in Delos at the time, but we are not sure about this particular one. Definitely, there are all these dedicatory inscriptions that clearly demonstrate the presence of Jews way before the Common Era. And then comes Philo Judaeus of Alexandria. He was born in close to 25 before the Common Era. He was the most eminent. See, Alexandria was a cauldron where Greek spirit and philosophy was developed even further. And then Judaism came also into play. So he was the most eminent Jewish philosopher of the era. He synthesized Platonic, Stoic, and Jewish ideas. He laid the foundation for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim rational theology. By the way, what we now call rabbinical Judaism and Christianity developed pretty much the same. Muslims developed 7 centuries later, but Judaism and Christianity, in the way that is practiced, developed the same time. The Logos, the Word of God, mediates God's absolutely to the creation, articulating divine wisdom in nature and in human intelligence. And I'm not going to bother you in reading all this, but in his book on the embassy to Gaius, he clearly mentions that there are many Jews in many communities in Greece, and the yellow color denotes different cities in Thessaly, Baioti, Macedonia, Attica, Argos, Corinth, etc., where there were Jews. And then the year 70 at the Common Era, Titus destroyed Jerusalem and the true diaspora started. Flavius Josephus, who was a contemporary in this area, he was Jewish, but he was a Roman citizen. And as a Roman citizen, he had all the privileges and rights of a Roman citizen. He was a Jewish historian, and he represents the Jewish Hellenistic spirit. And he writes about his book on the Jews. I have undertaken the present work thinking it will appear to the Greeks worthy to their study. It will contain all our antiquities and constitution of our government as interpreted out in the Hebrew scriptures, who the Jews were, what fortunes they had been subject to, and by what legislator they have been instructed in piety. It is said that around the first century of the Common Era, 10% of the population of Eastern Mediterranean was of Jewish faith. And wherever you see big stars are the places of major Jewish sites. However, the blue dots, you can see Jews all over the place. As a matter of fact, Apostle Paul, when he took his 3 trips to preach Christianity, he went to the synagogues. And we know that very well. He was in the synagogue in Thessaloniki, he was in the synagogue in Veria, he was in the synagogue in Athens, and above all in Corinth, where he wrote the epistles to the Corinthians. And you can see even in mosaics in Greek Orthodox Church, this is Paul, and these are definitely Jewish figures and the book and the covering of the head. And in Thessaloniki, this tomb was found, which is called cubiculum in Latin. And in the wall, you can see all the Jewish signs. And again, there is an inscription, God with us. There is also a very interesting find, this sarcophagus, which is dating from the Emperor Caracalla, which makes it 200 of the Common Era. And the interesting thing is that in the inscriptions are in Latin, in Hebrew, and in Greek. So he needs to have everybody on his side going to the next trip. Tragically, this cemetery in Thessaloniki, which was historical, was totally destroyed by the Germans and the Greek collaborators during the war, and history, a tremendous history of many centuries disappeared. Corinth was one of the most important ports of Mediterranean and the center of industrial growth during the Hellenistic and early Roman periods. Jews were merchants and textile coloners. They used purpura, which is the shell that provides the red color, which was so important for the imperial red color. Emperor Vespasian, it is said, that's why there's a question mark, that he transported several thousands of Jews as slaves to assist in digging of the Corinth Canal. It never happened, but they attempted on several occasions to dig the canal. We talked about Paul, who visited Corinth 3 times, and there are synagogue fragments dated from the 2nd century, while another fragment of menorah of the 4th century. And here they are, and if you go to the museum in Corinth, they're right there. Synagogi Evreon, of the Jews, and the menorahs. In Athens, Jewish merchants with business between Athens and coastal cities of Eastern Mediterranean was established around the 2nd century, before the Common Era as well. A statue of the high priest John Irkanos, or in Hebrew, Yohanan, John is Yohanan Cohn Gadol, was erected in Athens to thank him for the warm hospitality he offered to visit Athenian merchants and diplomats. And as in other places, there are several dedicatory inscriptions in Greek, but definitely it is denoting Jews. For instance, here the name is Amia Hierosolimitis, Amia from Jerusalem, or Benjamin from working in the synagogue. This fragment of a menorah was found in this area in the agora in Athens. Again, we cannot be 100% sure that this was the site of the synagogue, but we know that the Jews were around there for sure. That is definitely a synagogue. That was a synagogue. And there is this marvelous mosaic. This was found in the island of Chios, which is very close to the Turkish coast. And parts of the mosaic are beautiful, and all the inscriptions are in Greek. But if you read carefully, they all have Jewish meaning. And there is a synagogue in the island of Aegina, just an hour away from Piraeus. Again, beautiful mosaic and all the inscriptions in Greek. This mosaic was moved to the museum for protection, the Museum of Aegina. But if you go to Israel also, this is the Jewish Mona Lisa. The archaeologists are wondering in finding expressions, but all these mosaics are all, again, you can see there are Hebrews letters and there are Greek letters, and there are the signs, the 12 signs around, which is not very Jewish, but it was there. And actually, there are some other mosaics where the sun is in the center for Apollo. And this last one is from Jerusalem, from a synagogue. Ευλογία για το λαό, blessing for the people, and you can clearly see the Jewish signs and the shofar somewhere here. Then came Byzantium, and Byzantium was a theocratic Christian empire, was not the first Christian empire. The first was Armenia, but very close to the first large Christian empire, Christian Orthodox empire. And the legal positions of the Jews varied according to the emperor. Caracalla, as we mentioned earlier, he was one of the last Roman emperors. He bestowed citizenship of all residents of the empire, including Jews. Jews had the right to practice their faith as long as they paid the fiscus Judaicus, the tax. Circumcision was permitted within the Jewish faith. Synagogues were recognized as place of worship, and Jewish courts had the responsibility to enforce the law in civil cases only. Then came Theodosius, and things started changing drastically. Again, signs of the presence and the existence of Jews, and of course then came Justinian and Theodora in the 6th century, and there things really changed. By the way, at the time, the empire was huge, and whatever is orange was also a part of the empire. So you can imagine this was an area where, in addition to a lot of Christians, there were a lot of Jews. And Justinian, he wanted to revive the idea of unity of the empire the way that the Romans had it. But he got the wrong way. He officially recognized Judaism as heresy. He renewed laws forbidding Jews to have Christian slaves. And if you think, hey, what's the big deal? You don't have a slave. Well, if you don't have a slave, you don't have industry. You cannot have businesses and work and expand. Jews were excluded from government and municipality posts. He forbade Hebrew language from the synagogue, as well as the reading of the Talmud and the Mishnah. Nobody has explained why he excluded the Talmud and the Mishnah, but he did. And as a result of this, the Jews in the Byzantium, they created pituyim, which you will hear even now, and it comes from the Greek word poema, poem. There are many books on the history of the Jews during the Byzantine Empire. According to the periods, the empire started shrinking in the middle period, but Jews were again in all these places that you see the signs. David Jacobi writes that Jewish communities of the Byzantine world from the 10th to the 15th century, except for short periods of persecution, they enjoyed within the empire the status of tolerated minority. That's better than in many places over the Middle Ages, for sure. Romanian Jews spoke vernacular Greek in everyday life. Hebrew was established from the 9th century and became the language of liturgy, but also communication with Jews residing outside the empire. As a result, Jews recovered their language and started communicating with Jews in different port cities and commerce, so that the Christians didn't understand what they were saying, and they prospered with commerce for sure. Jewish communities were widely dispersed, as I showed you the map, overwhelmingly urban, but certainly among waterways and land routes, they wouldn't go to small villages. There were scholarly activities in several cities, as in Constantinople, Thebes, and Thessaloniki. In the late 13th century, immigration from other lands increased, primarily from Eastern Europe. That was the time that the first Ashkenazim moved in, but they were totally assimilated with the Greeks. The newcomers, as you can see, they were totally assimilated to the Romagnot milieu, and their language was Greek. People don't understand what Judeo-Greek means, and it's a very complex, it's not a language, it is a text written with Hebrew characters, but with Greek meaning. So you transliterate the Greek to Hebrew. Again, this was a means to bring back religion, but primarily business. Benjamin de Tudela, you probably heard about him. In his way to Jerusalem, he visited places from Spain. He visited places where Jewish communities, and he writes about the Jewish community in Constantinople, that he describes the status of Jews within the Christian society, their professions and their wealth, despite their oppression. Yet the Jews are rich and good and charitable and bear the lot, etc., etc., etc. And then the late period, that is very rich blend of Hellenistic and Palestinian rabbinic traditions. There was poetry and liturgy. Jews were masters in silk industry, leather industry, and money lenders. But there were also physicians, translators, and scholars. The Emperor Andronicus of Byzantium, in 1319, he issued a chrysobull, a decree, stating that the Jews of Ioannina, one of the northern towns that I'll show you later, are to live in a free and undisturbed state, just as other citizens. Constantinople was conquered by the Ottomans on May 29, 1453, and things changed again drastically. For the art lovers, this is a portrait of the Sultan Mehmet by Bellini, and it's a very prized portrait. For many, the fall of Constantinople was the beginning of the fall of the world. New Rome had fallen as Jerusalem did in the past. Christians started looking for signs of the second coming of the Messiah, while the Romagnol Jews start thinking that the Messiah is coming. Interestingly enough, this Rabbi Shabbatai Cohen Balbo from Crete, he wrote a lament about the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans. a small part of the Byzantine Empire was not conquered by the Turks immediately. Among them was the island of Crete. And there were the Venetians, and you can see the Venetian lion. The Jews under the Venetian role, they were allowed to practice their religion. They were landowners, which they were not in many other places. They were merchants for sure, produced and supply kosher food. I read that and I thought I didn't read it well. And I went back and read several articles. And it was very interesting. And certainly the kosher is the kosher I know, not Eastern European. They were exported sugar, wax, hides. There were money lending and banking for sure. There were Jewish quarters in Candia, Rethymno, and Chania, but there were no ghettos to lock them in at the sunset like they had in Venice. And there was isolated information regarding Jewish presence in a few other castle cities. Certainly, there were organized communities. We know that during this time, there were incredible Talmud scholars, rabbis, and poets, and several incredible books were produced by Hebrew scholars at the time. As I said earlier, all this is transliterated. It's Hebrew, but if you know Hebrew and you don't know Greek, you cannot understand. And again, here's another, and the whole the Matzor Romania was in Greek. The prayers were in Greek, and it starts, the Lord is one, the same way we say it in Hebrew. Then comes 1492 and the expulsion from Spain with the Edict of Alhambra by the very Catholic couple of King and Queen of Spain, and starts the exile. Interestingly enough, Jews were welcomed in the Ottoman Empire. Some stopped in Italy, but the vast majority came to what was at the time the Ottoman Empire. And it is said that the Sultan Bayezid II, who gave the okay for them to move, interestingly enough, his doctor was Jewish. And it is said that through this discussion with his doctor, he understood that people with several values could be relocated in the empire. And he said, how foolish of the monarchs of Spain to impoverish their empire while enriching my own. Jewish migration to the Ottoman Empire, as you see, the vast majority came from Spain and Portugal. Some came from Italy a little later and from France. As the Greek state expanded, we celebrate this year 200 years from the Greek Revolution that resulted in a free little country, as you can see here. And as the years were going by, the Greek state was expanding, and with the expansion of Greek state, there were more Jews because all or the vast majority of Jews, Sepharad Jews from Spain and Portugal, were living in northern Greece. But this is another story maybe for next year. This year we'll focus on the original Jews, the Romagnol Jews, and in the last study, there are 50,000 around the world, Greek-speaking Jews. The liturgy was in Greek, and they were living in several parts of Greece, particularly in Western Greece and what used to be the old Greece. There is a synagogue, Kahal Kadosh Yashan, which was built in 1826. However, there are finds of previous layers of synagogues. And given the fact that Ioannina was established as a city in the 9th century, it is estimated that Jews who were living in coastal cities at the time moved to Ioannina and settled there. And the synagogue is, for the Greek standards, is magnificent. It has nothing to do with the synagogue in Budapest or wherever. This is simple. It's got a vault. I cannot show it to you, but you don't see it from outside, and it is good for the acoustics. Another thing is that around the walls of the synagogue, you will see the names of all the people that perished. There is a cemetery, and recently, this was not the first cemetery, but apparently when the cemetery relocated, and interestingly enough, it's a cemetery that it is in the city. Normally, the cemeteries are not allowed in cities, but there is a tombstone of a rabbi of the 15th century, and it is thought that they moved some of the most important stones to the new cemetery. It's a huge area. And then there is another town, Chalkis. This is the town of my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. And according to bibliographical references, a Jewish community existed in Chalkis before the first century of the Common Era. Therefore, it's considered, if not the oldest Jewish community in Europe, with continuous presence before, during, and after the Holocaust. The Greeks entered Ioannina in 1913, and you can see the area of the Jewish neighborhoods with stars and welcoming the portraits of king and the queen. It is said that Jews brought carpets from their homes and laid them down so that the prince, the son of the king, walks to the synagogue that day. We know it happened. And the life in Ioannina was, there were rich people, very few, primarily poor people. And interestingly enough, the streets are still the same. This is the little street with my father's house somewhere there. And again, there were a lot of poor people. Some even had cars back in the 1920s. There is a big lake in Ioannina. Unfortunately, you cannot swim, and a little island. So one of the pastimes were taking trips to the lake and the island. And you can see the rich ones playing cards on their boats. But overall, there were peddlers and poor people trying to make a living as well as they could. Weddings, regardless of who you were very important. You can see this man, he wears a fez, which is Turkish, which means that these pictures were taken before the Greeks got in Ioannina. And what they did the night before the wedding, they would put the dowry on the bed, and you can see the beautiful bride, ornated velvet and gold thread, all made by hand. The whole town was following the bride, the whole Jewish community, to following to the synagogue. And interestingly enough, a difference from many Eastern European communities, there was education, and there was education for both men and women. Among other schools, so was a French school, the Alliance Israélite Universelle. This was a French project, and they built schools all over the Ottoman Empire and beyond. As a result, education became very important. The languages were Greek and Hebrew and French. So these kids were out with 3 languages back then. And there were many, many books. This is it, Agatha from Passover. Unfortunately, most of it was destroyed during the war, but some little pieces are still available for us to understand. Jews participated in political life. Here is the rabbi with all the Christian Orthodox, the rabbi is here, Christian Orthodox and muftis. They're walking to welcome the King George in Thessaloniki. Jews were allowed to vote, and before the war, before the Second World War, there were several Greek deputies. And here is the, there is a festivity for January 1st. And again, the rabbi is together with all the dignitaries in front of the Metropolitan Church. There was military service also, and Jews were participating. And this is my grandfather in the First World War, my father in the Second World War, and myself. I served in the Greek Navy for 29 months before coming to the States. Before the war, there were 78,000 Jews in Greece. 27 organized communities. There were synagogues, schools, hospitals, community centers, cemeteries, athletic clubs, and other religious and civic organizations. Then came the Second World War, and Greek Jews fought with the Greek army. There were close to 13,000 Jews, Greek Jews that fought in the army. 513 were killed. Several were wounded, out of which many seriously. This is the picture of Colonel Mordechai Frizis. He was he led one of the troops in Albania. He was killed, and he was the first high-ranking officer who died in this war. Greeks, as you might know, Italy declared the war in October of 1940, and Mussolini asked to just occupy Greece the same way that he had done with Albania and had transformed it in a protectorate of Italy. However, the Greek army pushed the Italians deep inside Albania, and then, as you can appreciate, Mussolini asked his body to come and help, and the Greek army was no match for the German panthers. So the Germans invaded Greece. This map is very important because the Greece was divided in 3 zones. The blue is the zone of occupation by the Italians, the red, the Germans, and the green by the Bulgarians. This is very important for the outcome of the Holocaust, because most Jews were concentrated in these areas. Greek Jewry suffered almost total destruction during the Holocaust. 86% of the 75,000 Jews living in Greece before the war were deported and brutally murdered in concentration camps in Germany and Poland. This is one of the highest percentages in occupied Europe. Most of the survivors owe their lives to the help offered by the Christian population of Greece, the leadership of Greek Orthodox Church and police, the resistance, and foreign diplomats. But above all, ordinary citizens risked their lives, the penalty was for sheltering Jews was death, providing assistance and shelter to their Jewish compatriots, while others assisted them to escape from occupied territories or to join the resistance against the Germans in the mountains. What happened in Auschwitz is well described. We are going, not with all respect, bypass, but this is what happened in Greece during that time. The Germans took Thessaloniki right away, but Italians were in Athens till the fall of Mussolini in 1943. And only then the Germans took over Athens. And Jugendstrup, the character that you see in the picture, he was the butcher of the ghetto of Warsaw. He is the one who eliminated the ghetto of Warsaw, and he was sent specifically by Ackman to eliminate the remaining Jews of Greece because the Jews in Thessaloniki were deported. The first train left the 15th of March, 1943. So they were all gone. However, and this is a copy of the decree about, all the rules and regulations and the Aryanization of the state. But in Athens, there was somebody who wouldn't take no for an answer and stood up to the Germans. And when he was called in to the Strup's office, and Strup said, stay away from this because I'm gonna shoot you. The Archbishop said that members of the Greek clergy may not be shot. They may only be hanged. And he was referring to what was happening to the Greek clergy during the Ottoman Empires. I beg of you to keep this tradition. And he left. But he did more. He and 60 people, prominent people, issued a decree against, and this was presented to the puppet Quisling Greek government under occupation and to the German authorities. And it's very interesting to focus on some experts of Damaskinos protest. He says, in our national consciousness, all children of Mother Greece are an inseparable unity. They are all equal members of the national body, irrespective of religion or dogmatic differences. Our holy religion does not recognize superior or inferior qualities based on race or religion, as it is stated. There is neither Jew or Greek in one of the New Testament, and thus condemns any attempt to discriminate or create racial or religious differences. We hope that the occupation authorities will realize in due time the futility of the persecution of Greek Jews, who are among the most peaceful and productive elements of the country. Now, this is very important because he's threatening them. If, however, they insist on this policy of deportation, we believe that the government, the Greek government, as the bearer of whatever political authority is left in the country, should take a clear stance against these events and let the foreigners bear the full responsibility for committing this obvious injustice. Because at the moment of judgment, the conscience of the nation will be heavily burdened by the moral responsibility shouldered by the rulers, especially if the powerful have failed to be noble-minded. Damaskinos died in 1949. The president of the Jewish community of Thessaloniki at the time wrote in the eulogy, "Only those who felt the agony of persecution can appreciate what it means to hear the moment you are haunted by the shadow of death, the voice of a man encouraging you, a man who has no fear of the enemy." We heard such voice, the voice of Damaskinos, at a time when others collaborated with the enemy or remained silent behind closed doors. In our hiding places, we felt his presence. One can only ask what would have happened if more important figures in occupied Europe had taken the stand of Damaskinos. But history cannot progress with ifs, so we have to go further. The statue of Damaskinos proudly stands in front of the Metropolitan Church in Athens, and in the pedestal is the caption that I just mentioned to you about the Greek church, clergy may not be shot. But Damaskinos was not by himself. He had partners, among them the chief of the police under occupation. He was working also for the intelligence service, the British, and he decided to help the Jews by printing Greek IDs. Those were not fake IDs, the original IDs, original stamps, but the names were fake. So here's my uncle, his ID, Aser David, and then magically he became Stamatopoulos Dimitrios. My parents had IDs also, and a lot of people got IDs, and that was one of the ways they were spared. And the third person that was very important, as opposed to Thessaloniki, was the Rabbi Elias Barzilai, the chief rabbi, and he was asked by the Germans to provide the list of all the Jewish families, including Jewish families that had moved from the north, because several Jews, in preparation for what was happening in Thessaloniki, had moved to the Italian zone. So what he did, he said, "I'll be back in 48 hours." And he destroyed all records. He alerted all the Jews of the German intentions and advised them to hide. He was taken to the mountains by the resistance and stayed there till the liberation. Ioanna is a different story. This is the day that Jews got a knock in the door and they were asked to get ready and prepare themselves for the trip. In order to be fooled, they asked them that they could take maximum 20 kilos of clothes and baggages. They didn't know where they're going. They didn't know what was happening. And unfortunately, there were no fake IDs. There was no Damaskinos. There was no powerful figures to protect some of them. And unfortunately, not a single Jewish family was hidden in a Christian house in Ioannina. Those pictures, one they were found in the German archives. And can you imagine, these poor people had no idea where they were going. Look where they're cutting with. Where did they think they're going to go? But there are some other positive stories, like the island of Zakynthos, and you might have heard of it. Again, in Zakynthos, there were two partners. There was the bishop and there was the mayor. And when called in by the German authorities, they refused to provide the occupation authorities with the list of the Jews of the island. When pressed to provide all Jewish names, they submitted a list including only their own names. The bishop, who spoke German, he told the German officer, "Here's your list. If you insist to deport the Jews, you must take us as well." In the meantime, they made sure that all Jews were provided shelter. There was not a single betrayal, and as a result, Zakynthos is the only place in occupied Europe with zero losses. This is the memorial for the bishop and the mayor. Interestingly enough, this building used to be the Jewish synagogue in Zakynthos. Was not ruined by the Germans by an earthquake in the 50s. And so the Jewish community dedicated to them. If you are interested, there are two great movies on the topic. And I don't know how you can download them, but if you have the titles, they are very interesting. There was another very great man, that was the Bishop of Volos, who was friends with the Rabbi Pesach. He was also friends with the German officer, Joachim was, because he was trying to save Greeks that were persecuted by the Germans. So when the rabbi went to the Germans and was asked to give the list, he goes to Joachim. And Joachim says, "Don't worry, you're not going anywhere." He shaved his beard. He handed him a letter, which is here. So this is not fiction. The letter exists. And he introduces the bearer, teacher, not rabbi, to everybody. And he asks people to help them. That same night, 50% of the population of Volos left to the nearby mountains and were protected by the guerrillas. And there were Jews that joined the resistance as well. There were about 500 that joined the resistance and fought against the Germans. And that also is very well documented. There was also resistance in Auschwitz. Some of you might have heard that on Saturday, October 7th, 1944, there was a revolt by the Sonderkommandos. Sonderkommandos were the unfortunate people that were working in the crematoria. They were the ones, some of them, they burned their own relatives. So in the 7th of Saturday of October, they revolted. And somehow they got ammunition from the women's camp, and they set crematorium 4 in fire. Crematorium 4 did not work since, but then there was damage to the others, and quickly after, they stopped using the crematory altogether. But the caption is very interesting from this man, Marcel Nazari. He was from Thessaloniki, and he writes that the feeling of revenge was keeping me alive. I want, if I survive, to take revenge for the death of my family. Those are pictures of people that perished during the Sonderkommando revolt. And that's the total list. there were others also. They were not just Jews, but they actively participated in this revolt. Marcel was keeping his memoirs in Auschwitz. And in them, he writes, I'm dying happy since that was in October, since I know that at this moment, our beloved Greece is free. Remember, Athens was liberated in October 12th. So this was about the same time. I will not survive, but I hope that my last words will survive. Interestingly enough, his memoir was found in a water canteen in the grounds of Auschwitz, and it was very damaged. But now, with a special technique, it was possible to decipher it, and it is now in the museum in Auschwitz. He came back, he served the army, and then he moved to the States. But he had the time to write another book with all his memoirs, including what the Germans wanted to hide, what the Sonderkommandos were doing in Birkenau primarily. Athens was liberated October 12, 1944. They start coming from the camps. Some were wearing, they had nothing. They were wearing the uniforms of the camp. And they found, and here you can see them also, they found their properties occupied by others. The synagogues were destroyed. Cemeteries were abandoned. Some of them immigrated to Israel, particularly the younger generation. Some decided to stay in Greece, and there were massive weddings, as this one with survivors in Thessaloniki immediately after the war. And then a few months later, babies start coming. We honor our saviors. This is the chief rabbi with the chief of the police. This is the bishop of Chalkis, Grigorios, in the synagogue in Chalkis, and Barzilai, the rabbi of Athens. There are 357 Greek righteous among nations. Their names are engraved in Yad Vashem as well. And those are personal heroes. There are memorials all over Greece, in every town that had a Jewish community, because most of these communities are totally gone. It took a long time, but then people that survived started writing their memoirs, and we're grateful because it's not just a story. They took me, they put me in the train, they starved me to death, but most of them have no bad feeling about the Germans. They look at it as something that happened, and they are very sad with what happened, and their psychology is incredible, but there is no real hate for the Germans in these pages. Every day, every January 27, there is a Remembrance Day in Greece. It is an official Remembrance Day in Europe and the United Nations. It's only United States and Israel that commemorate Yom HaShoah. This is a very moving story. This lady, Esther Cohn, she just died in October. She was in Birkenau. Her whole family, 38 people, died. She only survived with and her sister. They returned to Yanina, and she just died, as I said, in December. This is a picture of a few years ago when the German president at the time, President Joachim Gauck, he visited the synagogue. So guess what? She introduced herself with her number, 77102, instead of using her name. She also told him that, you know, it's okay to apologize, but what you need to do is pay for books so that the new generation gets better education, understands what happens, and hopefully we're going to stop some of the hate. And this is exactly one of the missions of the Jewish Museum of Greece, teaching not only about the Holocaust, but teaching teachers how to teach the Holocaust. This is a program that was started over 20 years ago in collaboration with the Greek Ministry of Education. And so every October, except this last one, they meet and they understand the ramifications, the teachers, I mean, of how to educate the teachers and how to talk to the kids in the classrooms. And here's an example of kids, school kids that are in the Jewish Museum and their teacher, and they get the information. And also through grants, 100 Greek kids, Christian kids, every year visit Auschwitz. In addition to education, the Jewish Museum is depository of rich history, whatever is left after the war and destroyed. There are incredible handwritten anthologies and of festive liturgical songs. This is a ketubah, but this is called Aleph. It's only for the firstborn boys. And it was, you can see all the Kabbalistic signs, but it was there to protect the baby for the first 40 days. There are not too many left, but there are some in the museums in Yanina. And beautiful costumes. Let me stop for a minute and interject. I didn't talk very much about Thessaloniki and Sepharad Jews, but this is important. Remember when I showed you a picture of the cemetery in Thessaloniki, which was huge. This was destroyed. There was silence for 70 years. The museum, the University of Thessaloniki, several of the buildings were built in the grounds of the cemetery. And there was never even a little indication of the existence of the museum. But in 2014, the mayor at the time, Boutaris, you might have had his wines, he decided, against a lot of reaction, to create a memorial in the grounds of the university. And in his speech, among others, he said, "The city is ashamed. The city of Thessaloniki was without excuse, very late in breaking its silence and start mentioning the darkest moment in its history. Today, however, she can say that she is ashamed for this unjust and guilty silence. She is ashamed for all the collaborators who worked with occupiers, for those neighbors who embezzled properties, for those who betrayed the ones who tried to escape. Is mostly ashamed for the officials who agreed, without protest, the Greek officials, to destroy in one night 500 years of memory and turn the biggest Jewish cemetery in Europe into a desolated area. We recognize that the loss of 56,000 Thessaloniki Jews is a loss for all of us. This not only sealed the past of the city, but did something worse, stole her future. Very powerful words that have not been spoken in many places of what used to be occupied Europe. Last year, there was a commemoration for the 75 years from the liberation of Auschwitz. The last survivors are walking probably for the last time. The Prime Minister of Greece was also there. And that was, again, the very first Greek Prime Minister visiting Auschwitz-Birkenau. And in his speech, he used one of the sentences of Ian Kershaw, who is British and one of the most important authors for the Holocaust. And he said, the road to Auschwitz was built by hate, but paved with indifference. We thought that it's over, but it's not. And people still play with fire. Those are Greeks. Despite what Greece suffered during the war, despite the country was in ruin, over 750,000 Greeks died. Villages were burned. Despite that, there were still people joining the not just anti-Semitic, neo-Nazi parties. Well, fortunately, in Greece, the Golden Dawn was voted out of parliament in 2019. And not only that, their leaders were recently convicted by the Greek courts and named a criminal organization based on what they were doing. So the little Führer is now resting comfortably in a Greek jail. But it happens all over, so be aware. And I used to say, okay, you deny the Holocaust, then what happened to all these people in different parts of Europe and their names are engraved there? Oh, it's all fiction. Sure, it's fiction. And around the world. But then tragically, those are pictures of last month in the Capitol. I didn't understand what it meant until I looked at it. 6 million were not enough. In America, in 2021, they are still talking about Camp Auschwitz. We cannot tolerate that. On the other hand, there are a lot of people, including Jews, that say, well, okay, we cried, we wrote the stories, we read the books, we saw the movies, enough is enough. Turn the page. Other people are suffering as well. Well, I'm sorry. We cannot forgive and we cannot forget. Look at this. what are you gaining by putting a little graffiti on the walls? Nothing. But these people are brainless, and unfortunately, they are among us and around us. But let's finish with a positive story. So this lady, Melpomene Dina, she is from the town of Veria. Veria is about 80 kilometers from Thessaloniki, and one of the places that Paul preached. So during the war, with her sister, they saved this family. Those are the children of the family. They live in Israel. And so they were poor. She would go to the fields and find whatever she could for herself and her sister, and to feed the father, the mother, and their 3 kids. The one died, but these 2 live in Israel. This is last year in Yad Vashem. And all she had to say is, I did the right thing. So, never again. Thank you.
Oof.
Oh my God, Mimis, thank you so much. I think you need to take a breath.
Ah, if you have questions, go ahead.
I think we all have to recover a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask questions as my students.
Good.
Mimis, I have never seen this group speechless. The impact you have made, it's just extraordinary.
Does this mean you'll never invite me again?
No, 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 no.
Because
There's,
remember,
there's just,
we,
there's
we
so much,
have we have the other part also.
there's just so much to absorb.
Yeah. Well, guys, don't be afraid. Ask the tough questions.
It was years ago when the film Shoah came out. And this was about the deportation and murder of Polish Jews. And I remember a moment where in the film, where one of the protagonists has gone back to the village as standing very uncomfortably between 2 villagers. And at one point he's talking later in the film and is talking about the people who saved him and his family and the threat of their children being murdered. And he said they were angels. There is no other word for them. And it was one of those moments like we're experiencing right now. Betty?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Your sound.
Unmute. Got it. Got it. Mimis, first of all, thank you. And I don't think I have anything to question you or ask about the content of your talk, but I really want to commend you on the way you built your talk, showing
you.
how this didn't have to happen, that there were periods in history, maybe not Justinian, but other periods in history where Jews were perfectly assimilated. There was a way that we could all live together. And the way you showed that historically, and then we get slammed with World War II and the continuing hatred that exists in the world with our contemporary tribalism, was just remarkable. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Merle's
Ellen?
right. We've never been speechless before.
No, never, ever.
You know, I've done a lot of research on the Holocaust and have made a documentary film as well. And no matter how much research I do, I keep saying, no, how does this couldn't possibly have happened. I mean, I mean, obviously all the evidence is there, there's no question about it, you know, but it just seems so incredible that so many people could be so either evil themselves or so silent and so intimidated and so afraid to actually to stand up for their neighbors and their friends. And they just turn the other cheek and let the horror happen. Years and years of research, and I'm still like, I just don't get it. It's just inconceivable that the scale of this hatred could wreak the havoc that it has, and you know, in the Holocaust and beyond. I mean, it's just still inconceivable. No matter how much research I do, it's still inconceivable.
We see, unfortunately, people cannot explain anti-Semitism. Yes, you can explain anti-Semitism because there was the Jesus killers or financial frictions or the Jews sucking their blood, whatever, because they were not allowed to lend money themselves. So the Jews came up and did that. But the issue is so complex, and over the years, why is there so much anti-Semitism in America right now, for instance? It's not just political. It could be a little bit of a lot of things. But if you think very carefully, there are people around us that if they hear a anti-Semitic comment, they will not say, stop it.
Right.
We are more interested in taking down Lincoln statue and other statues. That is the history anyway of the United States, but we don't look at reality. The same thing happened in Greece for many years. My parents survived because of these Christian families that were generous and took them in. And several other families survived. On the other hand, there were a lot of people that knew exactly what was happening. They took advantage of what happened. They took money, property, whatever. And this lady I showed you, and you know, I can spend time on each slide, I can just expand, but this lady comes back from Auschwitz, and they had, apparently the church had collected whatever was left of the Greek properties. And there were sewing machines. And she said, we had 2 sewing machines in our house. I'm poor. I'm left with nothing. She went to her home, and the person who had moved in Yanina, the oven was in the garden. And so the guy says, you know, you escaped the ovens of the Germans, get out because I'm going to throw you in the oven. And that's well documented. And then she goes to the church and she sees the sewing machines and she says, let me have one. and I can start mending and things to make some money. And the guy says, we know that there were two machines in your house, but we need you to give us the serial number. So she said, here's my serial number. She left. What I'm trying to say is, and those things now are openly discussed in Greece. Growing up, I really didn't feel very much anti-Semitism. Once in a while, they would say, oh, bad Jew, whatever, but was nothing malicious or, but further down, things derailed completely. And that is not a Greek phenomenon. That's an international phenomenon. And of course, some are hiding behind the idea of Israel. And
Uh-huh.
they say, well, you know, look what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. Excuse me, I hate to say I have nothing to do with Israel, but I am a Greek citizen and I fought in the war, and my father fought for the war, and that's the end of it. Why are you trying to mud the waters? But unfortunately, there is always an excuse. Oh, we are exaggerating. Oh, we took over the memory of the Holocaust, as others will do better. Anyway.
Is there much of a Jewish community now in Greece?
There is a total of 5,000 maybe Jews in Greece right now. But if you are interested to have the time and unmemorable time, come to Jan and I in the synagogue for Yom Kippur, and then you'll see what happens. The synagogue is packed. There are Jews coming from all over, and the community, mind you, is 40 right now, but they just elected a Jewish mayor. So anyway, but this is really a wonderful moment. Doesn't matter, believe or not believe, it's the sense of community and being there.
I have to say, I spent a summer on the island of Thasos,
Oh yes.
and I still think, despite all my travels, that Greece is the most beautiful place I have ever been. It's absolutely stunning, just amazing. But I knew nothing about the Jewish history at all.
Now you got a little taste.
Yeah.
It was very interesting learning years ago, and it obviously applies to the Greek Jews and the religious leaders and some civic leaders, that the reason Denmark was able to save its Jews and get them out from under the Nazis was because they looked at their Danish citizens as Danes, as part of the community. They were not the other. And they felt it was incumbent upon them to save their Jews, and they did. It looks like in many cases, parts of the Greek clergy and mayors were able to say, we are one. We are Greek.
But sadly, this happened in a small, yes, where Jews were small communities. In northern Greece, particularly in Thessaloniki, which by far was the most powerful Jewish community, the wealthiest Jewish community, there was friction with in 1922, Greeks were forced out of what is now Turkey. So there were 1.5 million refugees. And there were also merchants, carpet makers, whatever. A lot of them came to Thessaloniki, and immediately the friction started. And the economic friction was camouflaged with religious friction. Then came the Nazi ideas early in the 30s. So Thessaloniki was not well positioned from the beginning. The other thing is that, remember, Thessaloniki became a Greek city in 1912. Until then, Jews, the younger generations would speak Greek and would go to Greek schools. But Ladino was the everyday language. So they didn't even speak Greek. They didn't have the same feeling as the Greeks of the older Greece. And the Greek citizens, they were in total competition. I mean, they went there the same day. Before the Germans occupied Greece, there was what was called the Commando Rosenberg. And the Commando Rosenberg was this group that went in at Hitler's request to catalog all the Jewish property, who had the paintings, who had the carpets, who had the gold. And when they came in, they just went for everything. Now, having said that, there were several Greeks that collaborate with the Germans out of sympathy, but also because they thought the wind is blowing this direction and we can make some money. And so as soon as the Jews were deported, the Greek state under occupation with the Germans, they created companies that will take over Greek property, Jewish property. And they got apartments for 5 marks or whatever. When this was contested after the war, the courts worked in favor of the people who bought it. They said that was the law. They didn't do anything illegal, they bought it. So a lot of Greeks benefited from the Holocaust without question. But a lot of Italians benefited, a lot of French benefited, and on and on and on. So that's not let alone Poland, where they come back and they start killing them again. So, yep.
The role of the church was really very impressive. It's very similar to Bulgaria.
I was going to bring up Bulgaria.
Yeah, so it's a very similar thing where the Bulgarian clergy stepped in, and so the loss of Bulgarian Jews is minimal.
Well,
It's the least in Europe. And I remember my husband came home one day. He had an invitation to teach in Bulgaria, and Mimis David was Israeli and a clinical psychologist. And he said, I'm not going to Bulgaria. I said, you're going to Bulgaria. He said, why am I going to Bulgaria? I said, you as an Israeli and a Jew are going to Bulgaria to say thank you. And he didn't know that history, and then went for maybe 10, 12 years afterwards. But that's a very special history.
My understanding is that the only Jews from Bulgaria who died were the ones who were transported to Greece.
Mm-hmm.
From Greece. And let me chip in on this story, because it's not just the Bulgarian clergy, but
The king.
And the king, right? But mind you, Bulgaria was a member of the Axis. Despite that, the king and the Bulgarian parliament voted against persecuting the Jews in Bulgaria. However, if you remember in the map in northern Greece, there was a slice of green, and that was the Bulgarian zone.
Mhm.
The Bulgarians, historically, they wanted an exit to the Aegean. So when the Germans allowed them to take over this part, they thought that this would be permanent. So they tried to force the population to become Bulgarian citizens. And they asked the Jews and they offered the Jews to become Bulgarian citizens, have the same right as the Bulgarians in Bulgaria. And the Jews refused. The next day, there was in the city of Kavala, there were tobacco factories, and they gathered them all in tobacco factory and they put them in buses or trains through Bulgaria, and they were in a barge to cross the Danube, and a couple of the barges sunk, and so several of the Jews, the Greek Jews from the Bulgarian zone, they perished, but at least they didn't have to go through the ordeal of the crematoria and Auschwitz. Yeah, there are stories. Even Franco, who was a ally, the same feeling with Hitler and Mussolini. He protected the Jews that had Spanish passports. I passed by in my lecture that several Jews were saved because they had Italian or Spanish passports. And actually there were others, like there were an ambassador of Paraguay or some others, they were cutting passports, not too many. And then there were the Turks, that the Turks, because there were still people like the people in Rhodes, they were born under the Ottoman Empire. And these automatically had the citizenship that they could never lose, and Turkey petitioned and got them out. Again, those are the exceptions because 86% is pretty high.
I found it interesting that Holland always got a high marks because of Anne Frank,
Not at
and they
all.
were among the worst. And
Not at all.
France was better than Holland
There's a
in
Right.
percentages.
there's a quite wonderful movie called The Black Book,
Yes.
which is just about that story of and the Netherlands are such a contrast with Denmark, with
Mhm.
similar kinds of geography and population. And Denmark got out all its Jews before the Germans invaded, and
Well,
the Netherlands did not.
well, just a minute. The Germans were there. Actually, they established the rule of wearing a star.
Yes.
The first to wear a star was King Christian on his bike. There are pictures on his bike and a yellow star in his lapel saying that we are all Jews.
Yes.
And with this example, very fast, they had to also, it was difficult because the Swedes want to keep their neutrality. They were making money from the war, but they didn't want the Germans to invade. So it was difficult to convince the Swedish government to accept the Jews. That's why the whole thing was clandestine with little boats, and they passed them through. And interestingly enough, not only the Danish didn't take their homes, but it is said that they water their plants till they come back. So,
And one of the interesting things for our non-Jewish friends here, why the Jewish star? You couldn't tell a Jew without it.
well, In Greece, you couldn't, but in other places, it was a little different. But
Okay,
overall, you couldn't.
you know, but people have been in Germany for centuries. Anyway,
They fought for Germany. They got Iron Crosses in Germany,
right.
and this didn't help them. For that matter, the only other place is Finland. And interestingly enough, the Finn Jews fought with the German army against the Russians because the Soviets fought with Finland. They actually carved out a significant piece of Kerala. And so during this war, the Finn Jews, they fought on the side of the Finn government, which was heavily supported by the Germans. And there were German officers and Jews in there. And when the time came, they asked General Mannheim, and he said, no, they stay.
Joma had a question.
Anyway,
No, hi, Mim. It's nice to see you again. I remember your presentation from last year. I was just as speechless then as I am now. Did you not mention then also there was some Japanese ambassador that helped
oh
some
yes,
Jewish people?
yes.
Oh,
He was in Lithuania, and he gave passes against the will of the government, and he put them in a sealed train, and they went through Siberia and ended up in Shanghai. And if you go to Shanghai, there's still a synagogue, but there are no Jews now. But Shanghai became a place where several Jews from Europe found a shelter. And the Japanese didn't really bother the Jews, but this guy didn't fare well.
Sukihara.
Yeah. I mean, there are several. There is Schindler. There are some Portuguese. There are some French nuns, but all this doesn't add up.
It could have made a difference. Merle, you're friendly with Helen. And the Zells had, if I'm pronouncing it right, the Sukihara visas, because I guess Sam Zell's father had gone to Poland on business, saw the writing on the wall, came home, had the family pack up, got the visas, and instead of going through Europe, went east, and they survived.
Mimis, what do you want people to know? Like I knew very little about all this history. What would you like people now? Because when I saw that picture of that man at the, what is it, January 6th with the, what did you show, 6MWE?
Yeah.
I knew
That
nothing
is in,
of that.
that's in the capital, honey. It's not in Greece.
No, I
Right.
understand that. I mean, what do you want? What, because you know this, what are the things that one should be aware of? Like, what does one do?
I think we should have zero tolerance. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to engage in a discussion with somebody who is brainwashed and comes up with a t-shirt about Camp Auschwitz. But the more your surrounding hears and the people that are willing to hear, and the more that the newer generation, unfortunately, there is another poison these days, and this is called the web. You know, everybody writes anything and it appeals and it sounds sexy and whatever, and you cannot control that. But the more you give some reasoning, I cannot hold my breath, but certainly in some surroundings, things can get better. There are some people that are lost causes one way or the other, you know. You can do anything you want. You cannot, the same thing, look at the German officers or the Gestapo officers. Till the end of their lives, they were saying Hi Hitler, right? You cannot change them. They were beyond treatment.
You know, what has to happen, Shoma, is that those people have to be marginalized and isolated politically.
Yes.
We can't throw them in prison because unless of course they were involved in the insurrection, but we have so-called freedom of speech in this country, which we don't have 5 or 6 hours to go into that issue. But they need to be marginalized and co-opted out of the political process. And the problem is, you know who, I won't tell you what his name is because everyone knows it, did not do that. And he did it for his own personal selfish reasons. And the individuals who have allowed this to go on need to be punished politically. And that is how we're going to deal with this, because you're right. You can't change that man who would wear such a horrible thing on his shirt, but he needs to be put all the way out in right field with a wall around him. The wall we can't build literally, but it has to be a figurative wall.
I
So
meant on a,
excuse me, where are the politicians? You talked about one person.
Right.
Okay, how about all the ones who are still kissing his hand? How about none of them got up and condemned this T-shirt? How about even both Republicans and Democrats? They should have a session and say, this is unacceptable, this is intolerable. In the United States of America, we take a stand, all of us.
I agree with that 100%.
They don't do it. Politics.
Unfortunately, Mims, reading American history, these elements have always been with us. They have always been ugly. And whether it was anti-Black, anti-Jew, anti-everything, hate, I don't know what to do about hate. It is, I won't say central, but essential. And I'm not sure I want to say this, who we've become as a country. And it scares the shit out of me and for my grandchildren.
I think that you're so right, though, about the extraordinary influence the web has in disseminating all this hate. And all the Black sites, which I frankly don't understand totally, but the dark web where people have access that maybe people of a different mindset don't even know how to reach. I would hope that somehow in the grand scheme of things, there's a way to curb the rampant hatred that is brainwashing people on the web. And I know that's a complicated statement, and I know that it isn't an easy one to solve. But I think we
have to
can't.
start from somewhere, and I don't see any little baby step.
Exactly. That's my point. There's no
Because
leadership.
A little baby step.
Yeah.
Where is the mayor? She wants to take down all 45 statues. And again, that's another discussion altogether. If we were in Iran, and Merle was in Iran as well, and the palace of the Shah, it was not burned down. It's a museum because it's a part of their history. The Versailles is very well there, and they make money. They took the heads of the kings down, but the statues are up. Even when we were in Moscow, they have a place across from Gorky Park where all the statues of the Soviet era are there. They didn't destroy them. They didn't take them down because it's a part of their history. Anyway, that's another.
Taking the statues down is easy symbolism, but how do you get into what Merle's saying and establish enlightened self-interest, and what is in it for these haters to not be haters? And I don't know how you get there.
The answer is the new generation. the older ones are lost causes. They are beyond. Because as
There
I,
were an awful lot of young people in Washington.
That's
right.
true.
right. Anyway,
Betty?
No, I was just going to say that we're not, sadly, we're not moving in that direction. This morning, I was just reading about how they're trying to change the voters' laws.
Yep.
yeah, right.
In Georgia, I was appalled. I was just appalled, the idea that, to just say, okay, you don't want to vote for us, well, then you can't vote anymore. That just,
Well,
and
this
I
is,
think it's whites who are these undereducated whites. Not all of them are undereducated, but they're playing on undereducation. I think education and knowledge is always the basis for getting more information out.
But
the
leadership is educated.
Right.
right, that's what I'm saying. They're not all undereducated, but they're keeping the masses undereducated because it suits them. And but my point was that I think that as the whites are becoming, their numbers are becoming smaller and smaller, they're scared, and they're going to do whatever they can to keep their ivory tower safe. And if it means disenfranchising the population, I don't think that'll last forever. It might not happen in our lifetimes, but I mean, brown and black people are rising up, and as well they should. I mean, it's going to be ugly for all of us if there's a revolution, but
Well, you saw the unexpected. This year, there is a black and a Jewish senators from Georgia. That
I know. And so
And
what is the white
what are they
what are the
doing
white
now?
peoples in Georgia saying, okay, well, that can't happen again. Let's not let them vote anymore.
get this crazy woman out to start with.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, at
Anyway.
least they're senators in that 6 years. Who knows what can happen in 6
Right.
years?
Well, we have to see what happens in 2 years, which is
I
going to be
know.
crucial. Anyway, thank you, Mimis. I have to sign off. It's been
well,
I will sign off also, but thank you all
superbly
very much.
wonderful morning. I feel so engaged. Thank you.
An
Feel good,
amazing presentation,
good.
Nimitz.
Be safe. Get
Thank
out of your
you.
houses since most of you are vaccinated. And of course, with some precaution.
In several weeks, we're having my cantor, Alberto Mizrachi. who is
He's from Rhodes, you know.
exactly. And I hope you'll join.
Send me the invitation because as
Okay.
friends, tomorrow we're going to Jamaica. So
Have fun.
Well,
Thank
you.
Take care.
you.
Bye-bye.
Careful.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank
Bye.
you.